Iran and six world powers appeared to be edging towards a deal on its disputed nuclear activity on Thursday. All sides were citing progress in negotiations, building on a diplomatic opening from Tehran, although there were cautions that the discussions were, quote, tough. The United States said the powers would consider relaxing some sanctions against Iran if it takes verifiable steps to limit a nuclear program, a long, elusive compromise that could reduce the risk of another Middle East war. After brokering the deal to disarm Syria's Assad regime of chemical weapons, Russia is again taking the lead toward arranging a meeting between warring sides. The main Syrian opposition group, which is supported by the West, has signaled that it is willing to participate in talks hosted by Moscow with President Bashar al-Assad. The talks will likely focus on humanitarian issues, but a date and logistics have not been decided. There is optimism that if the sides agree to meet face-to-face, that peace talks could be the next step. But there are growing concerns that Western humanitarian aid to Syria isn't getting to the neediest of hands. A photograph widely circulated on the internet that has not been authenticated shows supplies from U.S. aid in the hands of Syrian jihadists. Fear of aid falling into the wrong hands, some assert, has caused Western governments to stop the flow of aid resources. David Keene is the author of Useful Enemies: When Waging War is More Important Than Winning Them, and he says the photograph has confused the humanitarian community. He is a professor of conflict studies at the London School of Economics, where he joins us via Skype, which means he has stayed up late for us. Dr. Keene, thank you so much for taking time to be with us. Do appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome.
You just wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, and in that op-ed you said the do no harm principle is leading to harmful results. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think the do no harm principle is something that was adopted from medical practice and applied to the humanitarian sphere. It had, in a way, some good origins in terms of some instances, for example, in Sudan and Ethiopia in the 1980s, when we know that humanitarian aid had some damaging effects, helping, for example, in the depopulation of rebel-held areas. When you position aid on the edge of that area, you don't give aid to the heart of that area. You can be an accomplice in depopulation and ethnic cleansing and so on. So there is that history of aid potentially doing harm. But I think what's happened now, if we look at Somalia, Sri Lanka, Syria, Afghanistan, and a number of other places, that's been very selectively applied, so that the international community has become very paranoid about aid actually falling into the hands of rebel or terrorist groups. And that is actually having the effect of greatly limiting the amount of humanitarian aid that's going to a lot of rebel-held areas in a number of different crises. And Syria, I think, is one,
Of course. And is there, in your estimation, a way to verify, first of all, that the aid is getting to where it's supposed to go and designed to go, as well as prevent it from ending up in the wrong hands?
Well, to some extent, diversion of aid in all humanitarian crises, I think, is actually inevitable. There are a lot of things you can do to try to minimize it. And to be fair, the American government, the British government, and others are really trying hard to do that. One of the questions, I think, is how rigorous and how time-consuming and how bureaucratic do you want your procedures to be? And there's quite a lot of evidence now that these procedures have become so cumbersome, and the fear of aid falling into jihadist hands has become so overwhelming that this is quite a major factor inhibiting the amount of Western aid that's going to northern Syria in particular. And of course, this has damaging knock-on effects, because we worry about aid fueling terrorism and feeding terrorists. But if there's a grave lack of aid from the West, and if most of the aid that's coming in to northern Syria is coming from Islamic charities, and a lot of the help that's being provided is actually being provided by jihadist militias, then obviously that sends quite a powerful signal to local people in Syria who's actually helping you, who's deserting you. And we've got to be very mindful that a lack of humanitarian aid can also be a cause of terrorism, a cause of disillusionment, and a cause of extremism. And I think this is getting lost, you know.
Indeed, it seems like it is a very fine line to walk. I want to ask you about another point that you made in this article. You said in the past 25 years there have been many lessons learned in the humanitarian community, but it seems that we have the knack for learning the wrong lessons. What did you mean by that?
Well, I think what we've done in a way is to take this idea of do no harm, you know, which in principle is fair enough, and to apply it in a way very selectively, particularly within the context of a global war on terror. You know, so this was an idea which originated in large part out of the damage that governments were doing, the manipulation that governments like in Ethiopia and Sudan were doing around humanitarian aid. But we seem to have picked that idea up and applied it very much to demonized rebel movements. You know, the Taliban, Al-Shabaab in Somalia, the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka. Mm-hmm. And there's this great fear now that aid organizations are going to be seen and are going to be seen by the taxpayer as somehow helping these groups that have been demonized, often with good reason, internationally. So this has become a kind of an abiding concern, I think, for a lot of aid organizations and a lot of donors. And the danger, of course, is that vast areas of the world and millions of civilians who are in some way associated with these demonized rebel groups because they live in the same areas are systematically deprived of relief. And then, of course, the rebel groups come to see this relief as very biased, you know, as following a geopolitical agenda.
Sure.
And then they very often decide that they're going to attack aid workers because they don't see the impartiality of the humanitarian enterprise.
Mm-hmm. And we're going to have to stop the conversation right there. The piece was very thoughtful. We want to thank you for taking some time, Professor David Keane. Thank you.
Yeah.
And this is Arise America.